Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Prepare for New Workloads and Apps, Imbuing Flexibility into Your IT Architecture. Today's event is brought to you in partnership with Rubrik and presented by Actual Tech Media. My name is David Davis of Actual Tech Media, and I'll be serving as the moderator. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar. We've got some really cool content lined up for you today, and we'll be doing a live demo, so make sure that you stay tuned for that. We want this to be an educational event, and we encourage your questions there in the handouts tab, or I'm sorry, in the questions tab. And we welcome all the good morning, good afternoon messages across coming in from across the United States and around the world. So thank you for those. But we also want your questions. We will be doing a dedicated Q&A at the end of the presentation. So get your questions in early. We're also doing our best question prize today. For the best question, we will be announcing the winner or contacting the winner after the event for an Amazon $50 gift card. And then finally, I want to remind everyone about in the handouts tab there, it's there that you'll find the full ebook to the Guerrilla Guide to backup and recovery best practices. Make sure that you download that. It's an excellent resource when it comes to data protection and disaster recovery, remote work, hybrid cloud, new workloads and applications, automation, all around data protection and disaster recovery. So make sure that you download that resource because it won't be as readily accessible after today's webinar. And finally, at the end of our presentation today, I'll be announcing the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card. You must be present on the live event to be eligible and meet the Actual Tech Media prize terms and conditions, which can be found in the handouts tab. If you're watching this on demand, of course, the drawing has already occurred. And with that, I'm excited now to introduce you to today's expert presenter. Welcome, Philippe Verlooy, Field CTO for EMEA at Rubrik. Philippe, thanks for being on.
Yep, thanks a lot, David. Excited to be here and to talk about imbuing flexibility for new workloads into your IT architecture.
Excellent. Take it away.
Perfect. So so what we sort of wanted to change in or share in the next 40 minutes or so is how you can, prepare yourselves as an IT organization for, the ever-coming change in IT environments and essentially dealing with onboarding these new types of applications, whatever form or shape they may take. So the idea really is a Rubrik perspective on how to best deal with that. But I think a lot of this information can be thought of more broadly and more generally as well. So with that, I'll sort of kick it off and share what I think is quite clear for everybody, that if you look at IT landscapes, sort of the one constant here is that it's constantly changing, essentially. So we've moved from a sort of client-server model to virtualization, and on-premises data centers, to public clouds, to hybrid clouds, but also things like maybe moving from an on-prem Exchange server, taking into account some of the critical vulnerabilities that were discovered this week, for example, and then onboarding things like Microsoft 365 as a SaaS platform, for example. But then also things like looking at, the way that you build newer types of applications, looking at, SQL, going to NoSQL kind of architectures, and then sort of, moving back. So there's always this constant change and this constant adaptability that's required from an IT organization to sort of adapt and work with these types of situations. Now, if we look at change and technology replacing, old technology being replaced by newer types of technology, that tends to happen in the consumer space. So if you think about things like MP3s, they're not broadly used anymore, at least not in my household. And everybody here is using streaming services like Spotify and Apple Music. So the MP3 sort of, download method has gone away almost completely. But if we try to map that same thing to IT infrastructures in organizations and enterprises, we don't tend to see that happening. So what we do see is that we constantly move sort of from one generation to the next. So we came from sort of the mainframe era, then we adopted virtual machines, we adopted containers. There's more and more talk about functions as a service or serverless types of scenarios, but we typically don't see these older technologies fall by the wayside completely, and an IT department ends up having to manage sort of all of them simultaneously. So getting rid of an older technology is typically very, very tricky. I remember not too long ago when I was a consultant, so this is maybe a decade ago, I still had a customer running mainframe on token ring networks with vampire tabs, and I mean, this was close to the 2000s. So it's amazing how long these technologies tend to stick around. Not only a change in the infrastructure layer, but also the way that they're used by organizations, right? So, one good example is S3 storage by AWS. So they built this sort of great product and sort of new way of consuming storage for organizations and enterprises. And then what they ask from an end user perspective is that you consume these services through an S3 API, which is sort of standardized, well understood, easy to figure out. But then what they saw is that a very large swath of customers wasn't adopting it, especially in the financial space, because the way that they've built their processes didn't really let them onboard this type of S3 API integration, and they wanted to do it in a more traditional way using SFTP in this case. So after a long time of back and forth between customers and AWS, in late 2018, they essentially built a fully managed SFTP service on top of S3. So that sort of just goes to show, how long these types of technologies have to stick around, and if they're really embedded into your customer processes, then it's not so easy to go from one platform to the next. So when we talk about flexibility, essentially what you have to take into account is figure out a platform that can, drag some of these older technologies with you into the future, expose these newer capabilities, but at the same time, don't lose sight of what you still need to manage, even if it's a sort of very long tail of older technology systems. Now, there's a lot of talk, of course, about abstracting some of these complexities away and abstracting the infrastructure away in some sense. But we do have to differentiate between portability and compatibility, like they're not the same thing. So portability is more of a business decision, whereas compatibility is more of a technical IT issue. So containerization is a good example here. It's not because you adopt a containerization strategy that you can essentially move from building a containerized app on a laptop by your developer to then sort of run it in a test environment on premises and then move it to the public cloud, or even from cloud vendor A to cloud vendor B. The abstraction doesn't work at that level, right? So the types of sort of surrounding technologies that are available between these different infrastructure components sort of dictate essentially what you can do and what capabilities you have around that. So in that sense, abstractions really aren't magical. You're still sort of adhering to sort of lowest common denominator, and you have to work with what that specific implementation is sort of offering. Another thing to point out is that if we sort of talk about abstractions through containerization, then you have to differentiate between like the project, and the project could be Kubernetes, and the actual product, and the product could be something like OpenShift or AKS managed Kubernetes services in Azure, or EKS in AWS. And of course, there's work being done around some of these things. Like in Kubernetes, you now have the conformance project, whereby they're trying to find a level of interoperability at the level of the API. So you have that level of abstraction, or things like running OpenShift across all of these, which is another way to look at this. But I just wanted to point out that just because you adopt this sort of type of technology. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden you now have freedom from your infrastructure and you can simply, move from one generation to the other or from one infrastructure layer to the other. So the way that we look at these things is, what do all of these applications have in common, essentially? So even in the mainframe era to functions as a service, they're all sort of manipulating data. So the applications live by the fact that they're manipulating and working on data sets. That's what makes them useful. So from our point of view as Rubrik, that's sort of our entry point into this space, is that if we focus on that component of it and make that more portable, that will definitely help you in making your infrastructure more flexible to adopting these newer types of technologies. Ultimately, I would say that whatever we're building from an infrastructure level, it's ultimately meant to serve the end user. So the end user cares about applications and cares about data. That's what he or she is using on a day-to-day basis. And essentially, what is powering those applications and what is serving that data is less of a concern for the end user. They just want to get on with their day and use the applications that they're supposed to use. So from a internal constituency inside of the IT organization perspective, there's also different parts of the organization pulling this infrastructure in different directions. So there's different requirements depending on who you talk to in an IT organization. So the infrastructure team is more concerned around high availability of my infrastructure, what is the security around this infrastructure, and how do I keep costs under control, whereas a cloud team is probably more interested in the automation piece around it and how can I deal with things like data sovereignty and data governance when I move things from a hybrid model into a public model and so on. And the application team really doesn't care about any of it. They're sort of interested in, I want to roll out new applications, I want to do this at speed, and I want to be completely independent of whatever the infrastructure and cloud team are cooking up. I just need an API to talk to and consume these services. So this leads to a lot of requirements, and those requirements lead to a lot of change inside of an IT organization. And of course, sometimes you can, as an organization, control and anticipate that change if it's coming from within, but sometimes it's coming from the outside and you really cannot control what's happening. You're just confronted with these requirements and you have to act and respond to those. So one example here is, Satya Nadella talking about the COVID pandemic, and this is already a quote from April of last year, I believe, where he said that they saw 2 years worth of digital transformation in just those initial 2 months of the pandemic, where there was a lot of hesitation of doing these digital transformation projects and a lot of internal reasons and friction of why things like SaaS applications couldn't be adopted and so on. All of a sudden that was flipped on its head, and now they were actually drivers to go ahead and onboard and adopt these types of technologies. So one example is Microsoft Teams, of course. So you sort of see this adoption curve from the early 2018s all the way to July 2019. I mean, it is a decent growth curve, but then once the sort of work from home situation kicked off, then what they saw is this extremely large exponential growth of close to 500% in sort of 1 year. So the amount of people working from home and now leveraging Teams not only for video conferencing, but to sort of share data and collaborate through Microsoft 365 really meant that you as an IT organization had to think quite differently about supporting these types of scenarios. So that really leads to this picture here, whereby the end user still, doesn't necessarily care about, how these applications and how that data is reaching him or her. It's just about using applications wherever they happen to be. So from a let's say perspective of the IT organization, you have on-premises data center, sort of private cloud workloads combined with infrastructure as a service workloads in the public cloud and SaaS applications. Maybe depending on the vertical you're in, you have edge computing coming on strongly, and then you have data sharing across all of these things. So it's quite tricky to then adopt a sort of good methodology as an IT organization to work in this sort of new distributed way of working. So the idea really is that you have to be extremely flexible. So it's not about being the the strongest IT organization, having the most intelligent, but it's really being able to respond to that change, wherever that change might be coming from, while at the same time sort of adhering to all of the specific regulation that you have to adhere to, specific security protocols that you've put into place, but still adopting these types of technologies as quickly as possible. So what is our sort of viewpoint on this then? If we have all of these sources of data and applications that you have to manage on a day-to-day basis, and we're not even listing all of them on the left-hand side here. Really the goal is to look at things like, how can I provide data mobility? So how can I take these quote unquote legacy sources and move some of that data that I can move maybe into the public cloud, or move it from a virtual machine into a container-based architecture and so on. And how do I then answer these age-old questions around data protection and data security and data governance? So that's really the focus of our platform that we've built, whereby we then say, thinking back to those different types of constituents you have internally, how do they then consume that data across these different infrastructure layers? So the idea really is to build this almost invisible data management layer that then helps you consume these services through a RESTful API, through maybe an SDK of your favorite programming language, maybe an orchestration using things like Ansible, Puppet, or Chef, or a scripting language like PowerShell, or maybe even a self-service portal like ServiceNow or vRealize. So the idea is you want this flexibility built into the system, and you want to abstract away that infrastructure layer at the back. And the way that we sort of provide that is by focusing really on the core assets, which are the applications and the data. And the way that we do that is we sort of eclipse them with an SLA, essentially. So you have your applications and your data. We ask you as an organization to define a service level agreement on that data set. So how do you want to protect that data in terms of how many copies of the data do I want? Where does the data need to sit? Do I need to replicate the data? Do I need to encrypt the data? Do I need to push it from on-prem into the public cloud? And then what are sort of the security controls around that data set? So that's baked into that SLA, and that then makes it independent of the infrastructure component that you want to run it on. Could be that today you want to run it in the private cloud, and tomorrow you want to run it on Cloud Vendor A, and then the day after tomorrow you want to sort of consume it from Cloud Vendor B. And the idea really is to get you that independence through focusing on the application and the data layer specifically. So a bit, or one level more concrete, I should say, then, is we have this multi-cloud data control system. We call it Polaris. And really what it does is it takes those SLAs that you define as an end user or as an IT administrator, could be infrastructure as a service, could be database PaaS services, could be SaaS applications. So it's really an engine that takes the desired end state as defined by you, and then translates that configuration into whatever infrastructure component you're managing at that particular point in time. And the other thing it does is it provides this single source of truth, as we call it, across this entire gamut of infrastructure. So really it makes it easy from the lens of that SLA to say, yes, I am compliant in terms of my data management across private cloud, all the way into public cloud, all the way into database as a service, etc. Types of scenarios, because it has visibility across all of those infrastructure components. So one other thing I wanted to point out before we sort of jump into a demo is, the question is, can't you really fix this, or can't you really abstract this away by infrastructure as code, essentially, whereby you say, I'm just gonna talk to all of these APIs that are available and use my automation or orchestration skills to sort of deploy these things automatically. I don't have to worry about it anymore. I take my desired input and I apply it to each of those destinations specifically. So then really the question is, can you do this in a declarative manner, or do you have to still do it in an imperative manner? So what I mean by that is, this is just one example whereby maybe you want to protect a virtual machine. And in the old world of imperative systems, you sort of have to declare on a step-by-step basis exactly each step you want to perform to get to the desired outcome. Whereby in our world, what we've decided to do is, because we've made this API method part of the core converged system, is we have what we call an API first architecture. We really ask you only to declare the end state, and it then looks like this. And then the system sort of takes that declared end state and figures out what the imperative steps in between should look like. So there's no need for you to sort of automate this in a step-by-step basis. The sort of backend system will do that completely in an automated way for you. So that's the big difference between trying to automate this in the old world versus trying to automate this in a system that's already built in that declarative model, which is really what we're aiming for here. So with that said, I sort of wanted to take the next 15 minutes or so to show you a demo of this multi-cloud data control plane, or Polaris as we call it, which is itself consumed as a SaaS service. So let me switch to sharing my screen. So you should be able to see my demo environment here. So really what the system is capable of, it all works on the basis of these SLAs that I mentioned before. So what we ask of you as a consumer of this service is that you define an SLA or a couple of SLAs that sort of make sense for your specific environment. So there's a couple built-in ones, but you can create as many of these as you want. So really the idea is, you tell us what sort of the end state is, and we give you some guidance initially around the source that you're trying to protect. And the reason that we're doing this is so we hide away all of the configuration that doesn't apply to this specific source, right? So if you're interested in, let's say I want to protect Amazon RDS type databases in the public cloud, then we'll hide away all of the configuration that's related to infrastructure as a service, et cetera, et cetera. So in this case, you say, I want to protect database pass services. We ask you a very small set of basic questions, like what are the RPO and RTO values? So you can say things like, I want to back up, twice a day, and maybe I also want a daily backup for 2 weeks. And that's essentially it. And the next question is, do you also want to do log-based backup? Because in this case, we're talking to AWS. And you give it a name. You say something like Actual Tech Media Demo, and that's it. Then you can sort of create an SLA. And once you have that SLA, you can then start to assign it to, in this case, AWS type environments in the public cloud. So if you then look at that, we have this inventory whereby we show you exactly all of the sources that you can protect. And the reason that we're calling it a multi-cloud data management is we have SaaS applications, we have on-premises environments, we have different cloud providers, and they can all be sort of managed through the same SLA-based concept. So for example, let's look at an on-premises environment first. So I have my vSphere environment here. I can go into it, and then I can see all of my on-premises virtual machines. We can assign these policies at a high level, maybe to the vCenter level, to the cluster level, to the host level, maybe to a folder or to an individual virtual machine, or on the basis of tags to automate it a bit more. And then the idea is, once a policy is applied, then we will go ahead and figure out, based on that declarative state that you've told us about, how to actually get you to that state. So, for example, here we have this virtual machine. You can see that there's a specific SLA assigned to that virtual machine. And then I can go to that specific object. We'll show you exactly sort of what we're protecting on that object. We have a calendar view here. Let's say I'm interested in restoring a piece of data of yesterday. I can then go to the recovery options. If I want, I can restore individual files. So if I'm interested in that, we'll sort of show you the full index of that virtual machine. And then you can say, I'm interested in this specific piece of data. I want to restore my games folder. And then you sort of are back in business after the recovery operation. So that's an on-premises workload, a more traditional VMware-based on-premises workload. Now we can take that same concept and we can apply it maybe to, let's say, an EC2 instance in Amazon. So I can go into Amazon, same rules apply. I have my SLAs. I can apply my SLAs maybe to the full AWS account, maybe to an individual EC2 instance, or even to a block volume inside of that instance. Really, the idea is, once that SLA is assigned, again, we'll take that declarative state that you've told us about and try to figure out how to make that happen. So again, let's say, in this case, I want to restore something from the 7th. You go to the 7th, and you have these recovery options. So same thing, let's say I want to restore individual files inside of an EC2 instance that's running in the public cloud. Again, we'll show you that full index of that system. You can browse, you can select what you want, or if you're sort of not quite sure where the file is, you can search the index and then pick out the specific file that you want to bring back, and you can then restore the data so you have it back. So we can do that individual file-based. We can bring back a snapshot. We can reassign snapshotted disks back to running virtual instances and so on. So there's a lot of options. But really the point of this is that it's all working on the basis of that multi-cloud control plane that takes in these SLAs and then sort of assigns them to these objects. Last example that I wanted to point out is a SaaS service. So similarly, we can protect something like Microsoft 365. Again, thinking back to that adoption curve that you saw in the beginning of the slide deck, whereby this is now extremely widely used in our customer base. You can do the same thing, assign an SLA, and then sort of let the system take over. Or you can make it a bit more granular, whereby you say, I'm gonna assign specific SLAs maybe to a SharePoint site, and in that SharePoint site, maybe then you have a document library, and maybe that document library you want to assign a specific SLA to. But in the end, it all ends up looking the same. So if you want to restore something, again, we'll get you to the calendar card. You pick the date you want to recover something from. You have the recovery options. We'll show you the full index, because we always build this index of what we are backing up, and then you have the ability to restore that data. So the index here should show up in a couple of seconds. Live demos are always tricky. Here we go. So let's say you want to restore something from this specific folder. Again, same workflow, get the data back extremely quick, and sort of off to the races. There we go. So, and then the final piece that I wanted to point out is, okay, that's sort of data management at one level, but that's not all we talked about, of course. So there's data management at different levels as well. So one other thing we can do is, because of having this virtue of seeing all of that data through backup, this is really a very good sort of choke point to see all of the data that you hold in your environment. So one of the other things we can do is we have this ability to find sensitive content on the basis of that backup data and sort of show you where that content is living and who has access to it. So the way it works is we have this ability to, on the basis of policies, as we call them. So for example, if you're in California, you can have this CCPA policy whereby we'll look for personally identifiable information on the basis of those policies through those backup sets, and then essentially show you all of the sensitive data that we're able to find. So on a day-by-day basis, you can sort of see here the increase or decreases in sensitive content hits on the basis of all of these policies that happen to be active at this particular point in time. And then what you can do, everything is interactive, so you can click into any point on that time bar. We'll show you exactly the objects where we found that sensitive data. So for example, here you see a virtual machine, you see some file sets. We'll show you how many sensitive hits came up in that particular object, which policies have been triggered, what the daily changes of those policies, like are you storing more sensitive content on that object than the day before, and what is the risk exposure of that object. So the risk exposure has to do with, you might have sensitive content under the CCPA regulation, but the risk exposure is sensitive content plus who has access to that content. Like, what are the restricting permissions that you have set on that sensitive content in terms of who can access it? So then the idea is I can drill down a bit further. We'll sort of at a high level show you the index again, where this is taking place, or I can directly go to the individual files that are triggering this. So in this case, for example, let's say I have this Excel sheet, and this Excel sheet is triggering 1,400 hits on the CCPA policy. And what you can do is you can see the details of that file, of course, and we can actually go to that file as well, which is sitting on a Rubrik repository. But you can also see who owns that piece of data, like who has ACL permissions on that piece of data, and sort of are they changing on a day-by-day basis? Are there people gaining more permissions on this data set going forward, for example? So that's a very quick and easy and non-intrusive way, because it's on the basis of backup, to sort of figure out, cross infrastructure, what am I holding in terms of data? Should that data sit in the public cloud? What are sort of the permissions around that data set? Should I make some changes in terms of data governance around it? So that's all visible through this portal. And then sort of the last piece that I wanted to point out is this concept of the ability to sort of detect anomalous behavior inside of your environment. So because we have this visibility across all of these infrastructure components, we also have this model whereby we can detect anomalous behavior on the basis of backup. So the idea really is that, again, being that ultimate choke point of seeing all of the data coming in, why don't we leverage that and look for signs of, in this case, ransomware? So the way that we're doing that is we are building this baseline of normal behavior historically for all of the objects that we see from a Rubrik perspective. So let's say we're creating a backup for a couple of days. Then those couple of days will allow us to build a baseline of what we consider to be normal behavior for that specific object. And then what we'll do is, if the next backup deviates greatly from that baseline of normal behavior, like all of a sudden we saw the file system activity explode on that object, that would then be a first good indication for our system to then more closely investigate if we can find additional signs of wrongdoing inside of that object. So we'll sort of use that first stage file system analysis to trigger the second stage, which then goes deeper into the object and looks at things like, did file extensions change? Or what is the level of entropy of data in the suspected object versus the non-suspected object. And then, for example, the level of entropy would then give us a very good indication of this data has been encrypted because it's changed, it's become so random that it must be encryption. So those things are then pushed through a machine learning backend, which will then give us this confidence indicator. So in this case, we can say we've detected anomalous file system activity. We're highly confident that it's anomalous. And next to that, we've also spotted high levels of encryption. So you can then open up this event here. We'll sort of show you the timeline of exactly what happened. And then we'll suggest an action that you can take. So if you click on Investigate Snapshot as a suggested action, again, we'll leverage the power of our index here. We'll show you exactly where this is taking place. So in this case, you see that it seems to be concentrated on the file shares. You can go into the file shares, and then let's pick a random one. Let's say HR department, where we've indicated 275 files were deleted. They were added again. So we find that suspicious behavior. Like, that is not normal behavior. That's not something that abides by the historical baseline that we've determined before. This is definitely something that's an anomaly. So you can then drill down. And then, for example, you have this very obvious example here whereby we have an Excel sheet that was deleted. It was later added again. But as you can see, the extension flipped from a benign XLS to now XLS.encrypted. So this is a very obvious one. It's not always this obvious, of course, but the other levels of investigation, like entropy and so on, together will inform that machine learning model if this is actually an issue or not. And then what you can do is, through this index, you have this very surgical way of saying what you want to bring back into your production network. So I can say, okay, give me all of the deleted files. These were the non-impacted files, and restore those to a clean target. And then that data is restored, and you left the non-impacted data alone. So you didn't overwrite the non-impacted data because you don't necessarily want to overwrite that by a backup set, because then you're sort of wasting all of the new modifications that were made by your employees, and you're sort of making that ransomware event even worse. There's other opportunities as well, like you do not have to do it on a file level. You can sort of bring back the entire machine, or I can, for example, even pull out individual VMDKs and mount them to a cleaning host or something like that. But there's a lot of opportunity to bring that data back, going from a very granular lens to a more broad stroke lens. But the idea is that this is all happening on the basis of that backup data that we're seeing coming in through Rubrik. So this makes it very, very easy to deal with that type of data. And again, the idea is that today your infrastructure may be focused on virtual machines. Tomorrow your infrastructure may be focused on containers or public cloud workloads. The idea really is that you need this sort of lens. I'm hesitant to say a single pane of glass because that's sort of oversold, of course, but you have this single way of taking that declarative policy that you come up with and sort of applying it across all of these sources, sort of making you ready to adopt whatever technology sort of makes most business sense for you going forward. So with that, I wanted to stop the demo and sort of jump into the Q&A section, see if there's any questions.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great presentation, Philippe. Thank you for taking time to do the demo. We got a lot of good feedback from folks out there in the audience. They said that the interface is beautiful and really enjoyed the demo as well. So we have a number of questions here. I guess I'll just start at the top because there's a lot of great questions. First one here, Kathy's asking, is this a SaaS solution or is this an on-premises install?
Yeah, it can be both. So the Polaris, so everything that I've shown you today is SaaS based. But of course, when you're in this mode of I have a hybrid environment and I want to protect, both sides of the infrastructure, then we do have a hybrid deployment as well, whereby we can essentially run the Rubrik on premises and control it via that SaaS service that you saw, which is consumed from the public cloud. So both are an option essentially.
Excellent. And then there's another question here. How can Rubrik help enterprises solve both data sprawl and data archival challenges? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So the idea really is that if you look at things like data sprawl, what we see a lot is that a lot of organizations have, many copies of the same data, and they're not essentially aware of that. So we typically see between 12 to 20 copies of the same data spread around on, sometimes even expensive storage arrays, production storage systems. And the reason for that is you typically need copies for things like test and development and so on. And maybe you want to take a database copy and run maybe a health check script against that database copy. So there's a lot of good reasons to have multiple copies of data, but it leads to data sprawl and having too many copies to work with. So one thing that Rubrik can essentially do is it can sort of limit those data copies by taking one sort of golden backup copy of your data. And then you do have the ability from Rubrik to manipulate that data for test and dev. So we can spin up test and dev environments on the basis of backup data. We can take data from an on-premises environment and move it into the public cloud. We can even help you migrate data from, for example, an on-premises vSphere environment, migrate it into an Azure virtual machine environment, all on the basis of that single data copy. So in that sense, we do have a good solution to sort of combat data sprawl. And then the second piece I would say there is you first have to really understand the data that you're holding, right? So that's where that the ability to look inside of that data content that I sort of showed you, which is our sonar-based interface, can really help a lot. So to sort of give you an idea of what am I actually protecting here and what am I actually managing here, and does it make sense, as you say, from an archive perspective to treat this data as production-ready data, or should I just archive it off to maybe an object store on premises or into the public cloud, for example?
Very interesting. I like that. Helping companies to reduce data sprawl by keeping a single copy of the data. Another question here. This came in during the demo. They're probably referring to, I think, what you were demoing there about SLA configurations. They ask, what if SLAs conflict between two distinct applications? For example, an SLA in the cloud on one data set and another SLA on premises. And then also, does this help to easily support migrating data out of cloud and then back?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. So we do have a sort of conflict resolution method as well. So if you do happen to assign SLAs at, let's say, different hierarchical levels, and they end up being applied to the same object, then there is a precedence level. Like the most specific SLA will typically win out. Like if you assigned an SLA to the object level itself, that will typically take precedence over an SLA that's sort of inherited from a top level object. So that's one way to sort of resolve that potential SLA conflict, and that's built in. And then the other piece of sort of moving data back and from the public cloud, we do have this capability, which we call Cloud On, whereby you can take an on-premises data set that you're protecting, you're storing it in the public cloud, and we can then activate that data set to then run in the public cloud. And then the idea is, in the public cloud, you then need to protect it again somehow. So we do that then for you. And then you do have the opportunity to specify another direction where the data should go. So from we call it a cloud cluster running in the public cloud, you can essentially say, let's take the example of running a cloud cluster in AWS. We can take that data and point it to Azure, for example. So that way you can say, actually, I now have an exit strategy to go from cloud A to cloud B. if I happen to choose to do so. So that flexibility is built in. Of course, there's always the what you do have to take into account is there's always things like egress costing and like moving data from one cloud provider to the other cloud provider, or even back from the cloud back to on-prem. There's always a cloud provider cost associated to that, so we're very conscious of that as well. So but the architecture that you design has to take that into account. But yeah, we can absolutely build a scenario where you can sort of move data back and forth between clouds or on-prem and the cloud.
Very cool. That's a tremendous capability to give companies that sort of flexibility in where their data sits, because it all ties back to cost really for so many companies and capabilities of these clouds. Next question: what about actual deployment of this? They're asking, do customers typically engage your professional services to implement this, or is this do it yourself? How does that work?
Yeah, it sort of depends, I would say. So it is an extremely easy system to set up. Like from a Rubrik configuration, not a lot needs to happen there. So that's very self-explanatory. But usually what we do is, and we have this sort of quick start sort of professional service capabilities around that. It's usually more around, what applications do I have and how should I treat those applications? Like, do I have a very large Oracle estate? Am I running things like, Microsoft SQL always on availability groups? And how do I want to deal with those types of scenarios? So that's typically then handled through, a very quick and sort of short-term PS engagement, or through our partner network that we have as well.
Got it. And then there's a follow-up question to that. What are the key success metrics, would you say, before and after Rubrik? Like, what do people see once they've put this in, replaced their existing data protection solution? What are kind of the big differences that they see where they say, wow, this is amazing?
Yeah, so I think the real core goal of the system, or the way that we've structured it, is we introduced a lot of simplicity into this process. So it's multiple different servers, physical or virtual, that together form this backup and recovery architecture. So we take that complexity away by converging the entire stack. So think of things like what Nutanix sort of did for the primary storage or for the primary application space, by converging sort of storage and virtualization together, and the likes of vSAN and others did that as well. The same thing Rubrik did sort of for the backup and recovery architecture, so that there's this big reduction of complexity. And also from an operational day-to-day, how do you manage it? That's also true as well. So the complexity of having to manage individual applications from a data management perspective, like assigning policies, creating backup jobs, setting blackout windows. So all of these things go away, because now you just have this concept of an SLA. And once you've decided upon that SLA, then Rubrik takes that declarative definition and then does that for you, does all of that heavy lifting for you. So you really don't have to go to the environment, except if you want to restore a piece of data. So the sort of success criteria, or the measurement, or the metric that you have there, is that Rubrik, you'll see an enormous decrease there. So I think that's probably the biggest success metric from an IT perspective that you'll see.
Very nice. Very nice. Let's see. Kathy said she loves the dashboard and she's curious what types of reports are available.
Yeah, so the system does have a lot of built-in reports. So I would say the main sort of reporting that we do is we track the compliance status with those SLAs that you've defined. So the idea really is, if you say this is the end result that I'm expecting, then of course we have to report on that end result, right? So we'll show you a very easy way to show you immediately in a sort of single snapshot, yes, the system is sort of within the operational bounds, and we are adhering to those SLAs that you've given us. But we do have a whole swath of different reports as well. So things like data growth and where is my data stored, and then also of course more typical operational things like if there's any failures that you want to investigate. So all of these things can be put into built-in reports as well, and they're part of the product. Like it's not a bolt-on thing. It's part of the main solution. And if you happen to prefer consuming these things in an external system, for example, a Splunk or something else, vCenter Log Insight, something like that, then we can definitely do that. So we've essentially already built those integrations. So if you just want to have like a single source of truth for all of that reporting information, that can be externalized as well via the API.
Excellent. There's a question about whether or not Rubrik can back up SaaS applications and do it in an automated or scheduled way.
Yep, absolutely. So today, the first SaaS application that we support is Microsoft 365. And that adheres to that same SLA-based concept. So it's, in a sense, automated. So you just say, I want X amount of copies per day. I want to keep it for this period of time. And then Rubrik figures out how to do that for those individual applications inside of Microsoft 365. So Exchange Online, OneDrive, SharePoint Online, and so on. And then you'll see us extend upon that as well. So we do have a plan to support more and more SaaS applications going forward. But today our first entry into the SaaS space is Microsoft 365.
Excellent. And then there's a question about ransomware. How can Rubrik help to prevent or predict or recover from ransomware?
Yeah, I would say, preventing ransomware is not our forte in the sense that there's no silver bullet, I guess. When it comes to ransomware, I think a defense in depth strategy is what you should aim for there. So you should have preventative measures, of course. So things like your, perimeter firewall, your EDR type of solutions, protecting clients, et cetera. And then where Rubrik sort of fits into that defense in depth picture is really the sort of recovery of last resort, in a sense, whereby if my preventative measures have failed, which sort of history has shown they will, right? So there's a lot of ransomware attacks happening. Then through Rubrik, at least you have this sort of guaranteed path to quick recovery. And what I mean by that guaranteed path is that Rubrik leverages what we call an immutable file system. So the data that you write to Rubrik is stored as read-only objects that cannot be changed externally again. So if you have a ransomware event inside of your production network, that ransomware essentially cannot spread to the Rubrik storage repository because, for one thing, we don't sit on the network using any sort of well-understood file protocol. Like we don't speak NFS on your network, we don't speak SMB on your network. So from that end, we're not exposed. But secondarily, that immutable file system makes sure that the data cannot be manipulated. Like once we have a copy of the data, that data is forever on that file system and will not be overwritten until the retention period that you've put in the SLA expires. So that's sort of the guarantee that we have to bring the data back. How we then detect that you have ransomware is through that portal that we showed in the demo, whereby we have this machine learning model going over all of your backups and then trying to figure out if this backup was impacted through ransomware, what the extent of the impact was. Again, looking at the index, like what files have been encrypted and which data should be left alone. And then you pick out that encrypted data, and then you simply have a couple of recovery options to sort of very, very quickly restore data back into production. Could be on a file level basis, or could be on a bulk recovery basis as well, right? So if you are in this situation where 20 of your virtual machines or 50 of your virtual machines have been impacted, you just want to get those 50 virtual machines back into production as quickly as possible. from a known good lost state, which is essentially what we can indicate. So there's multiple levels of protection and recovery capability. But again, I do want to point out that it should be part of a defense in-depth strategy against ransomware. I think that's the only feasible way to look at this is have your preventative measures, but also have your recovery methods implemented. And that's really where we fit in.
Well said. Great answer there. Thank you. Let's see. Another question, I think, and this is probably the last one before we wrap up because we're running out of time, and that is just simply, how should people get started with Rubrik?
Yeah, so we typically look when we talk to customers, we typically look for specific sources that we can very easily onboard. So if there's data retention requirements due to specific regulations, for example, so maybe there's data that you want to age out of your old systems. So we typically have this way of saying maybe there's a new modernization internal project, and you can get that data onto Rubrik quickly as a first sort of proof point of how easy all of this is, and then use that as a starting point to then later consume all of the existing data that you already had in your environment. And we can do this extremely quickly. We can essentially ship physical bricks to you as a customer as a sort of proof of value type of scenario, or we can demonstrate the value remotely as well through remote labs. But it's really easy and really fast to sort of do the first onboarding and get going with this. We typically see value after a couple of hours. So because there's no installation required as with a typical backup and recovery architecture. So we essentially show up with our appliance, you give us a couple of IP addresses, and we're off to the races. So it's really quick to see that first value onboarding.
Excellent. Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time in today's webinar slot, but I've learned so much. I know the audience has as well. We got a lot of great feedback. Unfortunately, there's a lot of questions we won't have time to answer live. We'll have to get back to those electronically. But thank you, everyone out there in the audience, for the excellent questions. And of course, Philippe, thank you so much for the excellent demo today. Really enjoyed your presentation.
Great. Thanks for having me. Enjoyed it.
Before we go, I want to remind everyone about the handouts tab right there, and that's where you'll find the free complete ebook on the Guerrilla Guide to Backup and Recovery Best Practices. Make sure that you download that ebook. It covers all sorts of topics around modernizing the IT infrastructure, securing your data, expand remote work and hybrid cloud, new workloads and applications, and automation of IT processes related to data protection and DR. So it's an excellent resource. Hope that you'll check that out before you go. And then finally, I want to announce the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card today. That's going to Travis Yo from Georgia. Congratulations, Travis Yo from Georgia. We'll be contacting our Best Question Prize winner as well after the webinar. Thank you again for all the excellent questions. And of course, thank you to Rubrik for supporting today's webinar. We'll see you next time. Have a great day. Bye-bye.